1916, Elephant Island, Antarctica. The distance from the cold Atlantic to the near vertical rock face behind them was just enough to make a shelter for the 22 men of Endurance. 2 remaining lifeboats from Endurance were placed upside down on the stony beach. Underneath, with the aid of some rocks and sail, the man had created a shelter from the cold, wet, and windy environment. Guano, bird poo, seeped through the base they slept on. Their sleeping bags were damp, their clothes were damp. The only heat and light came from burning seal blubber, their faces permanently black from the smoke. There was nowhere to go, no space to walk outside, just the Atlantic on one side and a vertical rock and a glacier on the other. The 22 men were waiting. Weeks earlier, 6 of their colleagues had set out in an open boat across the Drake Passage, trying to reach a whaling station on South Georgia. There was no way to know their friends had made it, every reason to expect they hadn't. For 4 months the men hunted seal and birds, boiled seal spine for soup, stuck together, told stories, talked about the food they would eat once they got home, and they hoped for a ship to arrive as evidence their leader Shackleton had made it and was coming to rescue them. The men agreed they would wait until mid-August. If no help had arrived by then, they would take one of the boats and set off across the South Atlantic themselves. Every day they kept a fire burning as a signal. Every day they looked out across the water. They hoped. I'm Mark Zwinderman. This is Contact Light, the Bookshelf, Episode 2, Endurance. The book, Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing, published in 1959. The book that almost single-handedly brought Shackleton's story back into Western public memory after 40 years of almost complete silence. Lansing wrote the book in the late 50s, and he had something no later writer could ever have. He interviewed most of the surviving crew members directly. They were in their 70s by then, but lucid and willing to talk in a way they probably hadn't been when they were younger. He also had access to private diaries that had not been published. The book is built from primary material, or it shows. Every scene has the texture of having been remembered by someone who was there. The prose is also extraordinary in a particular way. Lansing was a journalist by training. He stays out of the way. He lets the ice and the men do the talking. The chapter where the Endurance is finally crushed, the description of the sound of the timbers giving way over a period of weeks, is one of the great pieces of nature writing in the language. And it works precisely because Lansing doesn't dress it up. He writes like a war correspondent, which in a sense he is. It's around 280 pages. You'll read it in 3 or 4 nights, and you will find yourself recommending this book for the rest of your life. The moonshot. Now, I want to be careful here because the moonshot is the one most retellings get wrong. The expedition's original moonshot was the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The plan, which Shackleton had been organizing since 1913, was to land a party on the Weddell Sea coast and walk 1,800 miles across the Antarctic continent on foot, via the South Pole to the Ross Sea on the other side. Nobody had ever crossed Antarctica. Shackleton intended to be the first. That expedition never happened. The Endurance became trapped in pack ice in January 1915, drifted helplessly in the ice for 10 months, and was finally crushed in October. The continental crossing was over before it had begun. What follows, and the part that the book is really about, is a different moonshot. The moonshot the expedition didn't set out to attempt, didn't want. The new moonshot was to bring 28 men home alive. This is where the moonshot method's third lens earns its place. Navigation we've seen in the first episode, the why and the standing of an attempt. Propulsion is the engine. Life support is what keeps the mission alive, even when the original mission has died. Life support is the lens for what keeps the mission alive. It is the lens for the moonshot whose only deliverable is that everyone comes home. Now, by any reasonable assessment, the expedition was finished in October 1915. The ship was gone, the continental crossing impossible. The men were on drifting pack ice with no radio, no rescue, no plan. From that moment forward, what they had instead of a mission was a leader who had decided that bringing them all back was now the entire reason the expedition existed. Now, Shackleton was an extraordinary leader. The men almost all said they could not have wished for anyone else to be in charge and lead them to safety. There is no doubt that Shackleton made the big calls, got lucky many times over those 2 years, and that he felt a huge sense of responsibility. Now let's think about the men. They were all imperfect, and all with some sense of mutual responsibility towards each other. They were no heroes, but people placed in an impossible situation. They were not all friends. They did not all like each other. Shackleton took great care deciding who slept in what tent. These men worked at being together and surviving together. They argued, they fought, they helped each other, and at all times they realized that they needed each other to get out of this. For 5.5 months after the ship was crushed, they camped on drifting ice that was breaking up beneath them. When the floes finally broke, they took to the boats and they reached Elephant Island, the barren spit I described in the opening of this episode. Knowing they could not stay there, Shackleton and 5 men sailed 800 miles in an open lifeboat across the worst sea on Earth, the Drake Passage in winter, in waves the height of 5-story buildings, to South Georgia. Then they landed on the wrong side of the island. 3 of them, Shackleton, Worsley and Crean, then crossed 36 hours of unmapped mountain ranges in clothes meant for sailing, damp, cold, hungry. The whaling station was on the other side of the island. Late in the crossing, they reached a slope they could not descend conventionally. The choice was Shackleton's: freeze to death where they stood, or slide down on their backsides and trust to luck. Die slowly and for sure here, he said, or likely die quickly sliding down this thing. They slid. Then they heard a factory whistle. It was their contact light moment. They were not home safe yet, but they heard the morning whistle of the whaling station. It would take 4 attempts over 4 months, but Shackleton made it back to Elephant Island. Every one of these men was alive when Shackleton reached them on the 4th attempt in August 1916. And that right there is the moonshot. 28 men out, 28 men back. There is no other example in the literature of polar exploration or anywhere else I can find of a project where the original objective failed completely. The new objective was nobody dies, and the new objective was met without exception across 21 months of conditions that human beings have very rarely survived. Now, all of this failed many times, but 3 moments stand out to me. The first, the boat journey to South Georgia, April to May 1916. Shackleton and 5 men in the James Caird lifeboat, 22 foot, sailing 800 miles through the Drake Passage in late autumn. The Southern Ocean in those months produces some of the largest waves and worst weather conditions of any body of water on the planet. They had a simple sextant, a chronometer, and the navigational genius of Frank Worsley, who took sun sights from a pitching deck in conditions where a navigational error of more than a few miles would have meant sailing past the island entirely into open ocean and certain death. He missed by a margin small enough that they saw the island after 16 days. The second time was the men who waited. They waited for months on a tiny strip of rocky beach between a mountain and the sea. No news, no way of knowing if any help would ever arrive. And they kept it together. They shaved, they cooked, they told stories, they kept their improvised house and clean, they kept it safe, they argued. They never allowed despair to move in. It is also a story of hope, possibly a story of confidence in their leader. They had to believe. There is no heroic Shackleton if these 22 men perish. There's just a failed expedition leader who lost most of his men after leaving them on a tiny rock in the South Atlantic. They made it. Shackleton made it. They're heroes to me. The third, and the one that should give us pause, is the mountain crossing of South Georgia. Having reached the island, they found they had landed on the uninhabited southern coast, the whaling station being on the northern side of the island. Between them, a range of mountains that no one had ever crossed. Shackleton, Worsley, and Tom Crean, 3 men in damp and worn clothes, with only 50 feet of rope, climbed across a glacier and a mountain ridge for 36 hours without sleep. Near the end, exhausted and cold, they sat down on a slope they could not climb down and decided to slide down 500 feet on their backsides into the valley below, having done the calculation that staying still meant death and moving meant death, but slightly less certainly. They walked into the whaling station the next morning. The station manager, who had known Shackleton before the war, did not at first recognize the men in front of him. Each of those moments sat on the edge of disaster, none of them forced by events, each of them a choice, by a leader, by a navigator, by 22 men keeping a fire burning on a beach, to do the harder and slower thing rather than the dramatic and faster one. I ended up feeling quite differently about this story after reading Lansing's book. The usual story of endurance puts Shackleton in the center, and the men around him are a grateful group or a supporting cast. The book that Lansing wrote, and the story he was honest enough to tell, leaves me thinking this was about 28 imperfect men. Most of them didn't particularly like each other when they boarded the ship. Many of them argued, fought, fell out. They found each other irritating in the small, dark space they had no way to leave. And yet they stayed together, not because they had to, but because they kept choosing to stay together. Shackleton was the catalyst. He made the calls the men later remembered as the right ones. He took the boat journey because he believed it was his responsibility to get help for his men. The achievement was not his alone. There is no heroic Shackleton if the men on Elephant Island do not hold together. There is just a failed expedition leader who left his men on the beach and got himself home. And that is what makes this story so emotional compared to so many other of these historical narratives. And it is also what makes me think, now that I closed the book, about all the others. The polar literature is full of expeditions that did not return. Franklin's men, Scott's men, the whaling crews and sealing parties whose names were never even written down. The men in those stories were also imperfect. Many of them also tried to stay together. Many of them, we must assume, kept fires burning on beaches and looked at the horizon every morning hoping for a ship that just never came. We don't have their diaries. We don't have Lansing's interviews. There was nobody left to interview. The thing I keep thinking, finishing Endurance, is what so many others must have gone through who didn't make it. Next week, the country will look quite different. It's a frozen city on the Volga River, a German army that thought it was conducting a siege when it was, in fact, conducting its own destruction. Next week, Anthony Beevor's masterpiece Stalingrad, and the moonshot hidden inside the spectacle of the battle, the visible attempt never being the real one. Until then, go and read Lansing. Read it slowly. It's magnificent. I'm Mark Zwinderman, and this has been Contact Light, the Bookshelf.